My name is Vanessa, and I am 34 years old. Exactly 4 months after I buried the love of my life, my own family sat at my dining table and tried to take the roof over my head. My brother slammed a 30-day eviction notice down next to my coffee cup, laughing as my father told me I was too broke and too helpless to fight them. They assumed I would just cry and hand over my $2 million home and my late husband's life insurance. They thought I was just a grieving, unemployed widow who could be easily bullied. What they did not know was that taking off my coat in a federal courtroom would be the exact moment their entire corporate empire burned to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain while dealing with toxic family members who severely underestimated you. The evening of the ambush felt like any other mandatory family gathering I had endured my entire life. We were sitting in the formal dining room of the home David and I had purchased just 3 years ago in Alexandria, Virginia. It was a beautiful property, a historic brick house with tall windows and a sprawling garden out back, where David used to sit and read on Sunday mornings. The house was my sanctuary, the only place where I still felt close to him after a sudden heart defect took him from me entirely too soon. The grief of the past 4 months had been a heavy, crushing weight, making it hard to breathe on most days. But my mother, Beatrice, had insisted on this dinner. She claimed she wanted to check on my mental state to ensure I was not falling apart completely. I should have known better. Growing up, maternal concern from Beatrice always came with a hidden agenda. She was a woman who valued appearances above all else, always dressed impeccably, always concerned with what her social circle thought of our family. My father, Harrison, was the CEO of a regional corporate logistics firm. He commanded our household the same way he commanded his boardroom, with absolute authority and zero tolerance for anyone who dared to challenge him. And then there was Bradley. My older brother was 36, the vice president of my father's company, and the undisputed golden child. Bradley could do no wrong. He was groomed from birth to inherit the family empire, while I was mostly treated as a background character in their grand production of success. I had spent my entire afternoon preparing a roast and setting the table with our best china, trying to be a good hostess despite the hollow ache in my chest. David and I used to host dinners here all the time. He had a way of warming up any room, of making even my rigid parents crack a genuine smile. Without his easy charm to buffer the tension, the dining room felt cold and vast. My mother spent the first half of the meal critiquing the dryness of the roast and commenting on how pale and tired I looked. She told me I needed to stop wallowing and find a new purpose, perhaps a quiet administrative job to keep my mind occupied. They all believed I was unemployed, a helpless housewife who relied entirely on David's income. I never bothered to correct them, preferring to keep my actual career completely separate from their judgment. As I stood up to clear the dinner plates and serve the coffee, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The superficial chatter died down. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, while my mother folded her hands neatly on the table. I walked around, pouring dark roast into their cups, completely unaware that the trap was about to spring. I returned to my seat at the end of the table. That was when Bradley reached down into his expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila folder and tossed it across the polished wood. It landed right next to my coffee cup with a heavy thud. I looked at the folder, then up at my brother. His face wore a familiar, smug expression, the same look he gave me when we were children, and he got the larger slice of cake. "Go ahead and open it," Vanessa, Bradley said, leaning his elbows on the table. "We need to have a serious discussion about your financial situation." I reached out with trembling fingers, my initial thought being that they had found some old medical bills of David's, or perhaps they were trying to offer me a loan I did not ask for. I opened the flap and pulled out the top document. The bold legal text at the top of the page made my vision blur for a second. It was a lawsuit naming me as the defendant. Attached directly behind it was a formal 30-day eviction notice for the very house we were sitting in. My heart began to pound against my ribs. I looked toward my mother, seeking some sort of explanation, but Beatrice just took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes completely devoid of sympathy. I turned to my father. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. My father cleared his throat, adopting his most authoritative business tone. "It is a matter of corporate debt, Vanessa. I am afraid David was not the responsible, honest man you believed him to be. Over the last 2 years of his life, David borrowed heavily from our family logistics firm. He came to me claiming you two were struggling with the mortgage payments and requested a series of private corporate loans." I stared at him in absolute shock. David never borrowed a dime from anyone. He was meticulous with our finances. He managed a modest but successful consulting business, and we lived well within our means. "That is a lie," I said, finding my voice. "David would never ask you for money. We did not need it. The house is almost entirely paid off." Bradley laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Clearly you were completely in the dark about your own marriage, little sister. He owed our company $1.5 million. We have the promissory notes and the corporate invoices all bearing his signature. He was legally binding your shared assets to cover his failures." The sheer audacity of the lie left me momentarily speechless. They were sitting in my dining room, eating the food I cooked, and casually accusing my dead husband of massive financial fraud. The grief that had been keeping me numb suddenly ignited into a hot, blinding anger. "You are suing me for $1.5 million, I asked, gripping the edge of the table. "I just buried my husband 4 months ago, and you are trying to throw me out of my home." My mother finally spoke up, her tone patronizing and sweet. "Now, Vanessa, do not get hysterical. You have always been so emotionally fragile. We are actually trying to help you. Your father and Bradley have spent weeks trying to figure out a way to shield you from public ruin." "Shield me," I echoed. "Yes," my father said smoothly. "If our company takes this to probate court, it will be a public spectacle. The debt will completely drain David's estate, and you will be left with nothing but legal fees and public humiliation. We do not want to see our daughter dragged through the mud." Bradley leaned forward, tapping the manila folder with his index finger. "So we are offering you a very generous settlement. A quiet way out. You sign the deed of this house over to the company, and you sign over the payout from David's life insurance policy. In exchange, we will wipe the $1.5 million debt completely clean. We will not press charges against the estate for fraud. You walk away with a clean slate." I looked down at the documents again. They wanted the house. They wanted the $2 million property that David and I had poured our hearts into. And they wanted the life insurance money that was meant to secure my future. They were trying to strip me of everything I had left in the world, under the guise of doing me a favor. They sat there watching me, completely confident in their victory. They saw a woman who had spent her entire life shrinking away from their demands. They saw a grieving widow who they believed had no job, no income, and no understanding of corporate law. They thought I would be so terrified by the prospect of a massive lawsuit that I would blindly sign over everything just to make the nightmare stop. "You want me to sign over my home and my husband's life insurance tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "It is the only logical choice," my father stated firmly. "You have no income, Vanessa. You cannot afford to maintain a $2 million property in Alexandria on your own anyway. You are unemployed. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you within a year. Sign the papers. Bradley will help you find a modest apartment somewhere cheaper. We will even pay your first month of rent out of the goodness of our hearts." The sheer level of entitlement radiating from them was suffocating. For my entire life, they had treated me as the lesser child, the one who was never smart enough or successful enough to sit at their table. Now they were using that same narrative to manipulate me into giving up my entire net worth. I closed the manila folder slowly. I looked at Bradley, who was already holding out an expensive silver pen for me to use. I looked at my mother, who was adjusting her pearl necklace, clearly bored and ready to move on to dessert. And I looked at my father, who was watching me with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator who believed his prey was already dead. I pushed the folder back across the polished wood table. It slid until it bumped against Bradley's plate. "I am not signing anything," I said softly. My father's expression hardened instantly. Do not be stupid, Vanessa. You do not have the resources to fight our legal team. William Thorne is our corporate attorney. He will crush you in court. You will lose everything and end up on the street. I stood up from my chair and began gathering the empty dinner plates. Then I guess William Thorne and I will be seeing each other in court, I replied. Now, if you do not mind, the dinner is over. Please get out of my house. The room was dead silent. They were entirely unprepared for me to push back. They expected tears. They expected begging. They expected me to fold. Instead, I was kicking them out. But as I watched Bradley angrily snatch the folder from the table and storm out the front door, I knew this was only the beginning of their attack. They were going to try to ruin me, and I was going to let them try. The silence that followed my demand was heavy and absolute. For a brief second, nobody moved. Then my mother released a long, dramatic sigh. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times growing up, the sound of her profound disappointment in my existence. She slowly reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. "Vanessa, darling, please stop embarrassing yourself," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You have always been so financially illiterate. Do you even understand what you are looking at? These are corporate promissory notes. This is not balancing a household checkbook. This is real money." I pulled my hand away from hers, keeping my face perfectly still. "You have never understood how the world works," my mother continued, shaking her head. "Remember when you were applying to colleges? We tried to explain the importance of networking and pedigree, but you insisted on going to that state school. Look at your brother. Bradley went to an Ivy League university. He understands corporate structures. He is the vice president of a massive company. You should let him handle this mess. He is doing you a favor." Her words were designed to make me feel small, to drag me back to being the insecure teenager who was never smart enough, never polished enough, never worthy of the family name. It was the same tactic they had used my entire life. When Beatrice mentioned my state school, a flood of memories washed over me. I remembered working double shifts at a local diner just to pay for my textbooks because my parents refused to contribute a single dollar to my education. They had gladly written 6-figure checks for Bradley's tuition, his luxury off-campus apartment, and his fraternity dues. They called his expenses an investment in the family legacy. They called my tuition a waste of capital. I had graduated at the top of my class with zero debt, while Bradley had scraped by with gentleman's C's, partying his way through 4 years before being handed a corner office at my father's firm. Yet in their eyes, his piece of paper meant brilliance, and my hard work meant nothing. Bradley was the heir apparent, the brilliant strategist who could do no wrong. I was the scapegoat, the stubborn daughter who married a mechanic turned consultant, a man who worked with his hands and wore work boots instead of designer suits. "Your husband was a good man in his own way," my father chimed in, his tone patronizing. "But David was strictly blue-collar. He did not understand high-level finance. He got in over his head, borrowed money he could not repay, and now you are left holding the bag. We are offering you a clean break." They spoke about David as if he were a naive child who had accidentally burned the house down. David, who had built a thriving independent business. David, who used to laugh at their pretentious country club stories and remind me that true wealth was measured in peace of mind, not offshore accounts. They had always looked down on him, and now they were attempting to rewrite history. They were trying to portray David as a financial failure who had crawled to them for a bailout. It was a calculated insult designed to make me doubt the man I loved. But I knew David's accounting better than I knew my own reflection. Every penny was accounted for. The idea that he would secretly borrow $1.5 million from my father's logistics company was so absurd it bordered on comical. Bradley, who had paused near the hallway, walked slowly back into the dining room. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his tailored suit jacket. "Mom is right," Vanessa Bradley said, flashing a condescending smile. "You are completely out of your depth. You do not have the resources to drag this out. What are you going to do, hire a strip mall lawyer with your non-existent savings? We are trying to keep you out of federal court. If you fight this, you will be destroyed." The contrast between us had never been more apparent. Bradley stood there radiating unearned confidence backed by our parents' wealth and influence. He was completely secure in his position as the golden child, convinced that his title and his Ivy League degree made him untouchable. He was leaning heavily on his expensive title, entirely dependent on my father's money, and a hired lawyer to do his fighting. He had never fought a real battle in his life. He had never had to survive on his own. He thought power came from a business card and a tailored suit. Meanwhile, I stood in my dining room wearing simple clothes, grieving my husband and absorbing their collective disdain. They expected me to break. They expected the weight of their disapproval to crush my spirit, just as it had done when I was 18 and begging for their support. But I was not 18 anymore, and I was not the financially illiterate failure they so desperately needed me to be. I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not attempt to defend David's honor or my own intelligence. Defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of breath. Instead, I looked down at the manila folder sitting on the polished mahogany table. I placed my fingertips on the cardboard cover and slowly, deliberately slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of Bradley. "I decline your generous offer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet completely steady. Bradley stared at the folder, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "You decline," he repeated, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "That is hilarious. You really think you have a choice here? Let me spell this out for you, little sister. Our corporate attorney is William Thorne. Do you know who that is? He is one of the most ruthless litigators in Washington. He destroys multi-million-dollar companies before his morning coffee. When he gets his hands on this case, he will not just take the house and the life insurance. He will go after everything you own. You will be paying off David's debt for the rest of your miserable life." William Thorne. The name was meant to strike terror into my heart. To my family, Thorne was a legal god, a man whose expensive suits and aggressive courtroom tactics made him invincible. They wielded his name like a loaded weapon, fully expecting me to cower at the mere mention of a high-powered corporate lawyer. I simply nodded. "I understand," I said calmly. The sheer lack of panic in my voice unsettled them. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She had anticipated begging. She had wanted me to drop to my knees and plead for my childhood home. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," Vanessa Beatrice hissed. "When you are standing on the street with a trash bag of your belongings, do not come crying to us. We will turn you away. We are washing our hands of you completely." I turned my back to her and began gathering the empty coffee cups. I stacked the saucers, the soft clinking of porcelain ringing out in the tense room. I picked up the cream pitcher and the sugar bowl, balancing them carefully on a silver tray. My hands did not tremble. I was demonstrating absolute control, refusing to grant them the emotional explosion they were desperately trying to provoke. I knew that silence was often the most effective weapon against narcissists. By refusing to engage, I was denying them the satisfaction of a fight. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He buttoned his jacket, his face flushed with indignation. "Let us go, Beatrice," he commanded sharply. "We tried to do the right thing and settle this within the family. If she wants to be stubborn and ruin her own life, we will let William Thorne handle the extraction. We will see you in court, Vanessa. Enjoy the house while you still can." I walked to the kitchen, set the tray down on the granite counter, and turned back. They were gathered in the foyer, throwing on their coats, looking at me with supreme disgust. "I will show you out," I said politely. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. Bradley walked past me, snatching the manila folder and shooting me a venomous glare. My mother followed, shaking her head as if mourning my stupidity. My father paused on the threshold, his cold eyes boring into mine. "You always were a disappointment," he stated. I met his gaze flawlessly. "Have a safe drive home," I replied. I closed the door gently and turned the deadbolt. The house was quiet. The suffocating presence of my family was finally gone. I leaned against the door and took a deep breath. They had laid their trap. They believed I was an easy target, a vulnerable widow lacking the resources to defend herself. They thought they knew everything about my life. But as I walked back into the dining room, a slow smile spread across my face. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with, and they had just handed me the first piece of evidence I needed to destroy them. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of my living room, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I woke up with the same heavy stillness that had accompanied every morning since David passed. But today the grief was forced to share space with a sharp, cold focus. My family had declared war in this very house last night. Now I needed to prepare. I went through my morning routine with mechanical precision. I showered dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a dark sweater and grabbed my keys. Before I could tackle the forged documents Bradley had so arrogantly dumped on my dining table, I needed basic supplies. I drove to the local organic market down the street, a familiar place where David and I used to spend our Sunday mornings picking out fresh produce and artisan coffee. The store was relatively quiet. I filled my basket with a few essentials: fresh vegetables, a bag of dark roast coffee beans, and a carton of milk. I approached the checkout lane, offering a polite smile to the young cashier who had rung me up countless times before. She tallied the items, and the total came to $42.15. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my primary debit card, and inserted it into the chip reader. I waited for the familiar beep of approval. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, flat buzz. The screen flashed a red message: declined. I frowned, pulling the card out and wiping the chip on my sweater. That is strange, I murmured. Let me try it again. I inserted the card a second time. The machine processed for a moment before buzzing again. Declined. Insufficient funds. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up my neck. The cashier looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and awkwardness. I am sorry, she said softly. Sometimes the network acts up. Do you have another card? I patted my pockets, realizing I had only brought my debit card and my phone, leaving my main wallet in my home office safe. I apologize, I said, maintaining my composure despite the sudden spike of anxiety in my chest. I will have to leave these here and sort this out with my bank. I walked out of the sliding glass doors and into the crisp morning air, my mind racing. A declined card for a $40 purchase made absolutely no sense. I knew exactly how much money was in that checking account. It held my emergency cash reserves and the remainder of my most recent paycheck from the agency, totaling well over $40,000. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, locked the doors, and immediately pulled out my phone. I opened my banking application, bypassing the password screen with my thumbprint. The dashboard loaded, displaying my account summaries. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. My primary checking account balance read $0.00. I tapped on the account details, my eyes scanning the recent transaction history. At exactly 6 in the morning, a single massive withdrawal had been executed. The entire balance of $42,890 had been transferred out. I looked at the destination account. It was a corporate holding account registered to my father's logistics firm. For a moment, the sheer audacity of the theft paralyzed me. How could they legally empty my personal checking account without my authorization? Then the memory hit me like a physical blow. The account was a legacy joint account. When I was 19 years old, still navigating the world of personal finance and trying to survive without their help, my father had insisted I open my primary checking account at his preferred banking institution. He had required his name to be on the account as a joint owner, claiming it was necessary for him to occasionally monitor my financial responsibility or deposit emergency funds if I ever begged for them. I had never begged, and he had never deposited a single cent. Over the past 15 years, I had completely forgotten that his name was still attached to the paperwork. I used the account for basic daily expenses, completely oblivious to the backdoor access I had left wide open. My family had not hacked me. They had simply walked through the front door using legal channels. As a joint account holder, my father had the absolute legal right to withdraw every single penny without my consent or knowledge. I sat in my car, staring at the digital zero on my screen, understanding exactly what this was. This was not just a petty theft. This was a calculated strategic strike. It was financial starvation. In the world of high-stakes litigation, this was a classic siege tactic. They knew that fighting a fraudulent lawsuit against a lawyer like William Thorne would require a massive upfront legal retainer. A reputable defense attorney would demand tens of thousands of dollars just to review the initial filings. By draining my liquid assets, they were cutting off my oxygen. They wanted to ensure I was completely paralyzed, unable to hire legal representation, unable to pay my utility bills, and unable to even buy groceries. They were trying to manufacture the exact helpless broke widow persona they had accused me of being the night before. Just as I processed the magnitude of their strategy, my phone vibrated violently in my hand. The screen illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed my father's name, Harrison. I stared at the ringing phone, feeling a cold, calculating calm wash over me. I did not press accept. I let the phone ring, watching the screen until the call finally rolled over to voicemail. I waited exactly 2 minutes, giving him time to leave his message. A small notification popped up at the top of my screen indicating a new voicemail. I tapped the icon, raised the phone to my ear, and pressed play. My father's voice filled the quiet interior of my car. He did not sound angry. He sounded triumphant, his tone dripping with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just delivered the winning blow. "Good morning, Vanessa," he began, his voice smooth and condescending. "I see you discovered the little adjustment I made to your banking portfolio today. Consider it a down payment on the $1.5 million your late husband owes our company. I warned you last night that playing games with us would end poorly for you. The real world is an incredibly expensive place, especially when you have no income, no husband, and now no liquid cash." I sat perfectly still, letting his gloating words wash over me. He took a slow breath before continuing his monologue. "You thought you could dismiss us from your home like common solicitors. You thought you could act tough. But toughness requires leverage, and you have absolutely none. You are financially ruined, Vanessa. You cannot afford to pay a lawyer to defend you against William Thorne. You cannot afford the property taxes on that massive house you are stubbornly clinging to. In a few weeks, you will not even be able to afford the electricity to keep the lights on. The reality of your situation should be setting in right about now." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air, ensuring I understood the absolute desperation of my supposed position. "Beatrice and I are not monsters," he continued, his tone shifting to mock sympathy. "We are still willing to offer you the settlement we proposed last night. We will take the deed to the house and the life insurance payout, and we will wipe the slate clean. We will even return the $42,000 I transferred this morning so you can rent a modest apartment. But our patience is exceptionally thin. I am giving you exactly 48 hours to reconsider the mediation. 48 hours to call Bradley. Apologize for your embarrassing behavior, and sign the deed over to the company. If I do not hear from you by then, William Thorne will file the paperwork, and we will watch the courts take everything you have left. Do the smart thing, Vanessa, before you end up on the streets." The line went dead with a sharp click. I lowered the phone slowly, resting my hands on the steering wheel. The silence in my car felt different now. It was not the heavy silence of defeat. It was the sharp, charged silence before a storm. My father believed he had backed me into a corner. He believed he had stripped me of my only defense by draining my civilian checking account. He expected me to panic, to cry, to break down and call my brother, begging for mercy. He expected me to surrender my $2 million home and my husband's life insurance just to get my grocery money back. I let out a short, humorless laugh. The sheer arrogance of their plan was staggering, but it was also incredibly sloppy. They had executed a perfect attack against the woman they thought I was. They had executed a perfect attack against a financially illiterate, unemployed, grieving widow. But they had absolutely no idea that the woman they were attacking did not actually exist. The $42,000 they had stolen was certainly an inconvenience, but it was nothing more than a decoy account. It was pocket change compared to the secure, encrypted federal accounts I maintained through my agency accounts my father could not access in his wildest dreams. Furthermore, by leaving that voicemail, my father had just provided me with documented verbal confirmation of financial extortion and blackmail. He had explicitly linked the draining of my personal bank account to the demand for my real estate deed and life insurance. He had handed me the exact kind of evidence my threat finance department used to bury corrupt corporate executives in federal prison. I did not delete the voicemail. I saved it, backed it up to my secure cloud server, and flagged it as priority evidence. I started my car, the engine humming to life. My family had given me a 48-hour deadline to surrender. They thought they were turning the screws, applying maximum pressure to force a quick capitulation. But all they had really done was start a timer on their own destruction. I pulled out of the grocery store parking lot and headed back toward my house. I needed to get back to my home office. I needed to open my secure safe and retrieve my federal credentials. My family wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare, completely unaware that they had just declared war on the wrong person. As I drove down the familiar tree-lined streets of my neighborhood, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was not going to run, and I was certainly not going to surrender. I was going to let them exhaust their petty tactics, and then I was going to dismantle their entire lives. The drive back to my Alexandria home was swift and purposeful. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the frost, but the cold calculation in my veins remained. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, and parked my sensible sedan. The house stood quiet and resolute, completely oblivious to the legal and financial crosshairs painted on its brick facade. I walked through the front door, bypassed the kitchen entirely, and headed straight for my home office at the back of the house. I spent the rest of that day and the entire following morning maintaining absolute radio silence. My phone continued to light up with missed calls and passive-aggressive text messages from my parents, each one more demanding and impatient than the last. They were waiting for the inevitable crack in my armor. They wanted the tearful phone call begging for my grocery money back. Instead, I gave them absolutely nothing. By the time the clock struck 2 on the following afternoon, the silence must have become deafening for them. Narcissists cannot stand being ignored. It starves them of the emotional reactions they feed on to validate their own power. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping coffee and reviewing basic property documents when a loud grinding mechanical noise shattered the quiet of my suburban street. The sound was heavy and industrial, completely out of place in my peaceful neighborhood. I stood up and walked into the front living room, pulling back the edge of the sheer curtain to look out the window. A massive, heavy-duty flatbed transport truck was backing into my driveway. The reverse warning beeps echoed loudly, drawing the attention of several neighbors who were out walking their dogs or tending to their front lawns. But it was not the truck itself that made my pulse steady into a cold, rhythmic beat. It was the cargo secured to the flatbed. 2 pristine, absurdly expensive luxury sports cars sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. One was a cherry-red Ferrari, its exterior reflecting light like a mirror. The other was a sleek custom matte black Porsche. They were Bradley's prized possessions. He treated those cars better than he treated human beings, constantly bragging about their horsepower, their import costs, and their exclusivity at every family gathering. And directing the truck driver with exaggerated sweeping arm gestures was Bradley himself. He was dressed in a casual cashmere sweater and designer sunglasses, acting as if he owned the entire block. He pointed toward my spacious, detached 2-car garage, shouting instructions over the rumble of the diesel engine. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, but I barely registered the temperature. I walked down the brick pathway toward the driveway, my arms crossed comfortably over my chest. The transport truck hissed as the hydraulic bed tilted downward, preparing to offload the vehicles directly onto my property. Bradley spotted me approaching. He adjusted his sunglasses and flashed a wide, predatory smirk. He walked over to meet me, practically vibrating with arrogant energy. He was thoroughly enjoying his performance, clearly sent by our father to escalate the pressure since their phone calls had gone unanswered. "Well, look who finally decided to come outside," Bradley called out over the idling engine of the transport truck. "I was starting to think you had already packed your bags and run off to a homeless shelter." I stopped a few feet away, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "What are you doing, Bradley?" I asked. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the panic or hysteria he was desperately searching for. Bradley gestured grandly toward the two luxury vehicles now slowly rolling down the metal ramps of the flatbed. "What does it look like I am doing, Vanessa?" he sneered. "I am moving my assets. I have been paying an absolute fortune for climate-controlled storage downtown, and it suddenly occurred to me that I have a perfectly good empty two-car garage right here, well, soon to be my garage anyway." I looked at the Ferrari as its tires touched the concrete of my driveway. "You are trespassing," I stated plainly. "This is my private property." Bradley laughed, stepping closer to me to try and use his physical height for intimidation. He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping into a mocking, theatrical whisper. "Technically, little sister, this property is in dispute. Dad's lawyers have already drafted the filings. As far as the company is concerned, this house is collateral for David's massive unpaid debts. I'm just getting a head start on moving my things into my future garage to save on those pesky storage fees. Consider it a perk of being the primary shareholder of the company you owe your life to." The truck driver, a burly man in a high-visibility vest, unhooked the heavy winch cables from the Porsche and looked awkwardly between us. "Where do you want the keys, buddy?" the driver asked Bradley, clearly wanting to finish the job and leave. "Just leave them in the ignitions," Bradley instructed loudly, waving the driver off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "The property is completely secure. My sister here is going to keep a very close eye on them for me. Right, Vanessa?" The driver nodded, handed Bradley a clipboard to sign, and quickly retreated to the cab of his truck, eager to escape the tense family dispute. The hydraulic bed lifted back into place, and the massive truck pulled away. It left Bradley and me standing alone next to $500,000 worth of sports cars, parked illegally on my concrete driveway, completely blocking access to my own garage. Bradley turned his full attention back to me. He was waiting for the explosion. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry about the terrible injustice of it all. He wanted me to throw a hysterical fit so he could call our parents and gleefully report that I was finally breaking under the strain of their coordinated attacks. "You know, Vanessa," he continued, his tone dripping with fake sympathy, "if you do not like my cars parked here, you could always do something about it. You could hire a lawyer to draft a cease and desist order. Oh, wait, I forgot. You do not have any money. Dad told me about your little banking problem at the grocery store this morning. It is a real shame. A good lawyer requires a hefty retainer, and you cannot even afford a carton of milk right now. So I guess my cars will just have to stay exactly where they are until you sign the deed over to us and vacate the premises." The provocation was textbook. It was a classic bullying tactic designed to make the victim feel entirely powerless in their own territory. He was daring me to fight back, knowing full well he believed I lacked the ammunition to do so. He wanted a reaction. He needed a reaction to validate his fragile ego and prove his superiority over the sister he had always despised. I did not give him one. I looked at the bright red Ferrari. I looked at the matte black Porsche. Then I looked back at my brother's smug, expectant face. I did not argue. I did not threaten to call the police. I did not mention the absurdity of his legal claims or the cruelty of his actions. Arguing with a fool only proves there are two, and giving an emotional response to an emotional vampire is a losing game. Instead, I calmly reached into my back pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen, opened the camera application, and raised the device. I took a clear, high-resolution photo of the red Ferrari parked squarely across the left side of my driveway. I took a second photo of the black Porsche blocking the right side. I made sure to capture the license plates and the clear context of the vehicles obstructing my private property. Bradley's smirk faltered slightly, his brow furrowing in momentary confusion. "What are you doing?" he demanded, a slight edge of irritation creeping into his voice. "Taking pictures for your scrapbook. Go ahead, take all the photos you want. It does not change the fact that you are broke, Vanessa. You cannot afford to fight us. You are totally helpless." I lowered my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I maintained unbroken eye contact with him for 3 long seconds, letting the absolute silence stretch between us until it became heavy and uncomfortable. I did not say a single word. I simply turned my back on him and began walking up the brick pathway toward my front door. "Hey!" Bradley called out, his voice rising in frustration as his grand performance fell completely flat. "I am talking to you, Vanessa. Do not walk away when I am talking to you. You have 48 hours to sign those papers, or we are burying you." I reached my porch, stepped inside my house, and closed the heavy oak door behind me. The lock clicked shut with a satisfying final thud. Through the glass sidelight of the door, I watched my brother. He was standing alone in the driveway, looking utterly defeated and intensely agitated. He paced back and forth between his expensive cars, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He had come here expecting a glorious battle, a chance to crush his weeping sister into submission. Instead, he had been met with a brick wall of total unbothered silence. The disappointment radiating from him was palpable even through the solid wood and glass of my front door. He lingered for another 5 minutes, kicking at the gravel and checking his phone, likely hoping I would march back out and give him the screaming match he desired. When it finally became clear that I was not going to reappear, he pulled out his phone, angrily requested an Uber, and eventually got into the back seat of a nondescript sedan, leaving his prized vehicles sitting defenseless on my property. I watched the Uber disappear down the street. A cold, dangerous smile curved on my lips. Bradley thought he had just established dominance by leaving his luxury cars on my driveway. He thought he had successfully intimidated the broke, helpless widow. He was wrong. He had just handed me the perfect opportunity to strike back. I stepped away from the window and walked straight into my kitchen. The cold, mechanical focus that had settled over me earlier sharpened into something deeply pragmatic. Bradley had made a critical tactical error. He had assumed his wealth and his aggressive posturing made him immune to consequence. He had assumed I would be too paralyzed by the threat of a massive lawsuit to take any definitive action against him. I opened my laptop on the kitchen island and began a quick, targeted search. I did not want a polite neighborhood towing service. I wanted the most ruthless, predatory, legally untouchable impound company operating in Northern Virginia. Within 2 minutes, I found exactly what I was looking for: Apex Asset Recovery and Impound. A quick scan of their online reviews revealed a terrifying reputation. They were known for aggressive enforcement cash, only release policies, and exorbitant automatically compounding storage fees. They specialized in high-value repossessions and private property trespass removals. I picked up my phone and dialed the dispatch number. A gruff, impatient voice answered on the second ring. I kept my tone sharp and professional. I stated that I was the legal homeowner of a private residence in Alexandria, and that 2 unauthorized vehicles had been abandoned on my driveway, completely blocking my access. The dispatcher asked for the make and model of the offending vehicles. When I calmly replied that one was a late-model Ferrari and the other was a custom Porsche, the tone on the other end of the line shifted instantly. The impatience vanished, replaced by the distinct, eager hum of unadulterated greed. Luxury vehicle tows meant specialized flatbed requirements, extreme liability surcharges, and massive daily holding fees. The dispatcher informed me that a team would be dispatched immediately. I emailed a digital scan of my property deed and my matching government identification to their office to authorize the legal removal. 25 minutes later, the quiet ambiance of my suburban street was disrupted by the roar of heavy diesel engines. 2 massive, battered tow trucks rumbled down the road and pulled to a harsh stop in front of my house. The operators who jumped out of the cabs were highly efficient and entirely unsympathetic. They walked up my driveway, inspecting the pristine sports cars with calculating eyes. I stepped out onto the porch with the authorization paperwork in hand. The lead operator checked my identification against the deed, handed me a clipboard, and pointed to a signature line. I signed my name with a steady hand. I stood on the porch and watched the execution of my retaliation. The operators did not handle Bradley's prized possessions with the delicate reverence he always demanded. They moved with industrial brutality. They hooked heavy industrial winches to the undercarriages of the luxury vehicles. The mechanical whine of the cables pulling taut filled the air. I watched the shiny red Ferrari being dragged unceremoniously up the steep metal ramp of the first flatbed truck. The custom black Porsche quickly followed onto the second truck. The scraping of tires and the clanking of heavy security chains echoed loudly, drawing several of my neighbors out onto their front porches to witness the spectacle. I offered a polite wave to the woman across the street before turning my attention back to the tow trucks. Within 15 minutes, both vehicles were securely chained down. The operators climbed back into their cabs and drove away, hauling $500,000 worth of my brother's ego off to a high-security chain-link impound lot on the industrial outskirts of the city. My driveway was completely empty again. I walked back inside my house, locked the front door, and went to the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee. I poured myself a mug, sat at the island, and enjoyed the profound, uninterrupted peace of my home. I knew exactly how long it would take Bradley to return. He had likely taken an Uber to his exclusive downtown gym, or perhaps to a high-end steakhouse to meet his corporate friends. He was undoubtedly boasting about how he had successfully dominated his weak, grieving sister by taking over her property. He would want to let a few hours pass, allowing the anxiety and helplessness to properly marinate in my mind before he returned to check on his assets. 3 hours passed. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the front lawn. I had just finished reviewing a secondary file on my secure laptop when the peace finally shattered. It started with a frantic, aggressive pounding on the heavy oak wood of my front door. The brass knockers slammed against the wood with violence. The doorbell chimed repeatedly in a chaotic, erratic rhythm. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the hallway wall. Bradley was standing on my porch. His expensive cashmere sweater was rumpled. His designer sunglasses were pushed up onto the top of his head. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, and he was sweating visibly despite the cool afternoon air. An Uber sedan was speeding away down the street in the background of the camera feed. Bradley spun around, staring wildly at the empty concrete driveway where his cars had been sitting just hours prior. He kicked violently at a heavy potted plant near the bottom step, sending soil spilling across the brick pathway. He looked completely unhinged. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I set the mug down on the counter. I walked down the hallway with measured, unhurried steps. I wanted him to wait. I wanted the panic to fully saturate his nervous system. I reached the door, slid the heavy metal deadbolt open, and pulled the door inward. Bradley almost fell inside as the door swung open. He caught his balance, grabbing the doorframe, his eyes wide and wild with a manic desperation. "Where are they?" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "Where are my cars, Vanessa? Did you move them? Did you give someone the keys?" I stood solidly in the threshold, physically blocking his entry into my home. My posture was completely relaxed. "I did not touch your cars, Bradley," I stated plainly. "Do not lie to me," he yelled, stepping closer, flecks of spit flying from his lips. "They were right here, $500,000 worth of vehicles. If you had someone steal them, I swear to God I will have you arrested for grand theft auto. I will call the police right now and have you thrown in a cell." He fumbled frantically in his pockets, pulling out his phone. His hands were shaking so badly that he lost his grip. The expensive phone clattered onto the porch floor. He scrambled to pick it up, his arrogant facade utterly shattered. He was no longer the untouchable corporate vice president looking down on his inferior sibling. He was a frantic, terrified boy who had just lost his most prized possessions. "You can call the police if you feel the need to do so," I replied, my voice smooth and entirely unbothered. "But dispatch will just redirect you to the local municipal log. The police already know exactly where your vehicles are located." Bradley froze. His thumb hovered over the shattered screen of his phone. His breathing was heavy and ragged. "What did you do?" he demanded, a new dark kind of dread creeping into his eyes. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans. I pulled out a glossy, cheap-looking business card. It was bright yellow with bold black lettering. Apex Asset Recovery and Impound. I extended my arm holding the card out to him. Bradley snatched it from my fingers. He stared down at the bold text. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He looked up at me in absolute, unadulterated horror. You had them towed. You had my Ferrari towed by a commercial impound lot. They were trespassing on private property, I explained simply. I told you this morning this is my house. You abandoned uninsured, unauthorized vehicles on my driveway and blocked my access. I took the appropriate legal action to remove a safety hazard. Bradley looked back at the cheap yellow card in his shaking hand. Do you have any idea what these places charge? He shrieked, his voice climbing an octave. They use specialty flatbeds for luxury imports. They charge exorbitant handling fees. They charge a premium daily rate just for storage. It is Friday afternoon, Vanessa. If I do not get down to that industrial park and get them out by 5 o'clock today, they will lock the gates and charge me holding fees for the entire weekend. That sounds like a very stressful logistical problem for you to solve, I noted blandly. It will cost me thousands of dollars to get them released today. Bradley screamed, his voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. Thousands in cash. These shady lots only accept cash. You crazy witch, you set me up. I looked at his panicked red face. I remembered his mocking words from just 3 hours ago. I remembered the way he had laughed at my supposed poverty, the way he had gleefully dared me to stop him. I channeled his exact tone, dropping my voice into a condescending, theatrical whisper. You cannot afford the impound fees, I asked, feigning deep, tragic sympathy. You should really manage your finances better. Bradley's jaw dropped open. He stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of my response. Before he could utter another word of protest, before he could hurl another desperate insult, I took a step back inside my house. I grabbed the edge of the heavy oak door and slammed it directly in his face. The solid thud of the door shutting cut off his screaming instantly. I turned the deadbolt, sliding the heavy metal lock firmly into place. I walked away from the foyer and headed back toward my kitchen, leaving my brother standing alone on the porch, thoroughly defeated by the very sister he thought he had broken. I walked away from the foyer, leaving the muffled sounds of my brother shouting on the front porch behind the thick oak door. The house settled back into its familiar, comforting silence. For the past 4 months, this silence had been a heavy blanket of grief, a constant reminder of David missing from my daily routine. Today, however, the quiet felt entirely different. It felt like the hushed anticipation of a loaded weapon. My family had spent the last 24 hours treating me like a wounded animal, circling me, waiting for me to bleed out from their financial starvation tactics. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought taking $42,000 and parking 2 sports cars on my driveway would break my spirit. They were about to learn that they had not backed a wounded animal into a corner. They had walked blindly into a trap. I bypassed the kitchen and moved down the long hallway toward the back of the house. At the very end of the corridor sat my home office. David had always loved this room. He had painted the walls a deep, calming navy and built the custom oak bookshelves that lined the perimeter. To the casual observer, to my parents and my brother, on the rare occasions they deigned to visit the room, looked like the unassuming workspace of a low-level remote worker. I stepped inside and closed the solid core door behind me. I turned the brass thumb turn, locking the deadbolt with a sharp click. I walked over to the windows, pulling the heavy blackout curtains tightly shut, plunging the room into shadows before flicking on the small, focused desk lamp. I moved toward the largest bookshelf on the far wall. I reached up to the third shelf, grasped the spine of a thick, hollowed-out vintage encyclopedia, and tilted it forward. A hidden magnetic latch released with a soft thud. I grasped the edge of the heavy oak shelving unit and pulled. The entire bookcase swung outward on concealed heavy-duty hinges, revealing a solid steel wall behind it. Embedded in the steel was a state-of-the-art biometric security safe bolted directly into the foundation of the house. I pressed my thumb against the glass scanner. A tiny green light swept across my fingerprint. A computerized voice prompted me for a secondary passcode. I typed a complex 16-digit alphanumeric sequence onto the keypad. The heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a deep mechanical groan. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside sat the reality of my life. The reality my arrogant father, my condescending mother, and my foolish brother knew absolutely nothing about. I reached into the safe and pulled out a heavy matte black laptop. It bore no brand logos, only a small engraved barcode and a tamper, evident federal asset tag. Next to it sat my government identification badge. I picked up the heavy plastic card and looked at it. My photo stared back at me, set above a gold seal and a bold capitalized title: Director of Threat Finance, Federal Cybersecurity and Financial Intelligence Agency. I was not a financially illiterate housewife. I was not an unemployed widow desperately trying to balance a checkbook. I was a high-ranking federal director in Washington. I commanded a covert division of forensic accountants, cyber intelligence operatives, and federal auditors. My daily routine consisted of tracking international money laundering rings, dismantling corporate embezzlement schemes, and auditing multi-million-dollar defense contractors to issue or revoke high-level federal security clearances. I hunted corrupt corporate executives for a living. I froze assets, seized shell companies, and sent billionaires to federal prison. My family knew none of this. They had absolutely no idea who I was or what I did. Their ignorance was not due to some elaborate cover story I had constructed. Their ignorance was the direct result of their own profound, blinding narcissism. When I graduated from my state university with degrees in forensic accounting and cybersecurity, my mother had sighed in disappointment. When I landed my first job in the intelligence sector, I tried to tell them at a Thanksgiving dinner. My father had interrupted me halfway through my first sentence to boast about Bradley closing a minor logistics contract. They assumed I did basic technology help desk work from home because they simply never bothered to ask. They never inquired about my title, my agency, or my day-to-day responsibilities. To them, a woman working from a home office in the suburbs could only be doing low-level administrative tasks. They needed me to be a failure, so Bradley could shine brighter. So they willingly believed the fiction they had created. Even David, who knew exactly what I did and was incredibly proud of me, had suggested I correct them. But I had refused. Keeping my federal clearance and my high-stakes career quiet had given me peace. It kept their toxic, greedy hands out of my professional life. I let them believe I was a low-level tech support worker because it made me invisible to them. But now that invisibility was my greatest weapon. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my modesty for poverty. They had drained my civilian decoy checking account completely unaware that my federal salary and my actual wealth were secured in encrypted government credit unions that my father's regional bank could never access. They thought taking $42,000 would starve me out. They had no idea my division tracked billions of dollars across the globe every single day. My financial resources were entirely untouched and vastly superior to their failing logistics firm. I carried the heavy black laptop to my desk and set it down next to the manila folder Bradley had dropped on my dining table the night before. I opened the laptop. The screen flared to life, prompting me for a retinal scan and a physical security key token, which I inserted into the side port. The federal operating system loaded smoothly, granting me direct access to the most powerful financial databases in the United States government. I sat down in my leather office chair, my posture straightening. The grief that had been weighing me down was channeled into a razor-sharp, lethal efficiency. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the legal documents my father and brother were using to try and steal my home. I spread the supposed promissory notes and corporate invoices across my desk. They claimed David had borrowed $1.5 million from their logistics firm. They claimed he had signed these papers. I stared at my late husband's forged signature. A cold fury settled deep into my bones. Stealing from me was one thing. Slandering the name of a good, honest man who was no longer here to defend himself was a line they should never have crossed. I reached for my desktop scanner and fed the fraudulent documents into the machine one by one. The high-resolution digital copies appeared on my encrypted monitor. I opened my agency's forensic analysis software and began to run the files through the system. I wanted to see exactly how sloppy my brother and father had been. I wanted to map out every single routing number, every corporate letterhead, and every digital footprint attached to these fake invoices. My father and brother were arrogant corporate men. They thought they knew how to play the game of high-level financial intimidation. They thought hiring a ruthless attack dog lawyer like William Thorne would guarantee their victory in probate court. They believed their wealth and status made them untouchable. They believed they could crush a grieving widow without facing a single consequence. But they had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. They had brought a fabricated civil lawsuit directly to the desk of a federal investigator. They had handed the director of threat finance written proof of their own criminal activities. I watched the progress bar on my forensic software slowly fill with green light as it analyzed the routing numbers printed on the fake invoices. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my coffee. Tomorrow I had a mandatory mediation session scheduled with William Thorne at his lavish downtown office. My family expected me to walk into that room completely broken, terrified, and ready to surrender my house. I decided I was going to give them exactly the performance they wanted. I was going to play the helpless, financially illiterate victim to absolute perfection. I was going to let them feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory right up until the moment I pulled the floor out from under them. The notification for the mandatory mediation had arrived via a heavy certified letter 2 days prior. William Thorne was not a man who requested meetings. He summoned his targets. The letter was thick with aggressive legal jargon threatening immediate, devastating court action if I failed to appear at his downtown Washington office by 10 in the morning on Tuesday. They wanted to drag me out of my safe zone and onto their turf, a place where the mahogany walls and expansive views were specifically designed to make opposing parties feel hopelessly small. I decided to lean entirely into their fantasy. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, carefully curating my costume for the morning. I bypassed my tailored suits and silk blouses. Instead, I pulled a drab, oversized beige trench coat from the back of the guest closet. It was a garment I kept strictly for doing messy yard work in the rain. It swallowed my frame, making my shoulders look slumped and defeated. I applied a subtle layer of matte gray eyeshadow beneath my lower lashes, creating the perfect illusion of hollow, sleepless exhaustion. I tied my hair back into a messy, unkempt knot. To complete the ensemble, I grabbed a cheap, flimsy yellow legal pad and a plastic ballpoint pen with the cap chewed off. I looked absolutely pathetic. I looked exactly like the broke, terrified, financially illiterate widow my family believed me to be. The drive into downtown Washington was choked with the usual morning traffic, but I used the time to mentally review the intelligence I had gathered the night before. I parked my modest sedan in the subterranean garage of Thorne's gleaming glass skyscraper and rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor. The reception area of Thorne & Associates was a pristine testament to corporate intimidation. The floors were imported Italian marble, and the receptionist sat behind a massive slab of raw granite. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the frayed hem of my trench coat with poorly disguised disdain. I gave her my name, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. She directed me down a long, silent corridor lined with modern art that cost more than most people earned in a decade. I pushed open the heavy glass door to the main conference room. My father, my brother, and William Thorne were already seated at the far end of an absurdly long, custom-polished walnut table. The staging was intentional. They had positioned themselves with their backs to the floor-to-ceiling windows, forcing anyone sitting across from them to stare directly into the blinding morning glare. It was a cheap psychological trick meant to establish immediate dominance. As I walked into the room, clutching my yellow notepad against my chest like a shield, the conversation between the three men abruptly stopped. Bradley leaned back in his plush leather chair and let out a loud, barking laugh. He did not even attempt to hide his amusement. He looked me up and down, his eyes tracing the oversized, wrinkled fabric of my coat. "Look what the cat dragged in!" Bradley sneered, leaning over to whisper loudly to our father. I told you she was cracking. She looks like she has been sleeping in her car. Maybe the towing company is hiring. My father did not laugh, but a deep, satisfied smirk settled onto his face. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, looking at me with the kind of clinical detachment one might reserve for a wounded insect on the sidewalk. Take a seat, Vanessa Harrison commanded, gesturing vaguely to the empty chairs on my side of the endless table. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I have a lunch meeting at 1 o'clock. I pulled out a heavy chair and sat down, keeping my shoulders hunched. I placed my flimsy yellow notepad on the polished wood and clicked my cheap plastic pen. The sound was loud and hollow in the cavernous room. William Thorne sat between my father and brother. He was exactly the kind of man I had investigated countless times in my line of work. He wore a $6,000 suit, a heavy gold watch, and the arrogant sneer of a man who had never faced a consequence he could not buy his way out of. He steepled his fingers, staring at me, as if trying to calculate exactly how few minutes it would take to break me completely. Mrs. Vanessa Thorne began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, dripping with false patience. I must admit, I am somewhat surprised. I was informed by your father that you were officially notified of the severe legal gravity of this mediation. Yet I see you have arrived without legal counsel. Where is your attorney? I looked down at my hands, letting my voice waver slightly. I do not have an attorney, Mr. Thorne. I could not secure a retainer in time. My funds are tied up right now. Bradley let out another sharp snort of laughter. Tied up, he mocked. That is a very polite way of saying completely bankrupt. She is broke, William. We told you she would not be able to afford representation. She barely afforded the gas to get down here today. Thorne raised a hand, silencing Bradley with a subtle, commanding gesture. He turned his predatory gaze back to me. It is highly irregular for a defendant in a corporate liability dispute to represent themselves, Mrs. Vanessa. In fact, it is practically financial suicide. However, since you have chosen to proceed unrepresented, I am legally obligated to inform you that I represent your father's logistics firm, not you. Nothing I say today should be construed as legal advice for your benefit. Do you understand? Yes, I whispered, staring down at my blank yellow notepad. I understand. Excellent, Thorne said, leaning forward. His entire demeanor shifted from falsely polite to openly aggressive. Then let us stop wasting time. We are here today to offer you a final, extraordinarily generous opportunity to settle this matter outside of the public court system. As I am sure your father has already explained, your late husband engaged in a pattern of gross financial misconduct during the final 2 years of his life. Thorne reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of pristine, heavy bond paper. He did not hand it to me immediately. Instead, he held it in his hands, using the documents as a prop for his performance. He spoke slowly, using exaggerated enunciation, clearly operating under the assumption that I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand basic financial terminology. Your husband David operated a small consulting firm, Thorne continued. What you apparently did not know is that David's firm was failing. To cover his mounting losses and to maintain the comfortable suburban lifestyle you were accustomed to, David approached your father's logistics company for a series of high-risk, unsecured corporate loans. I kept my eyes fixed on Thorne, maintaining an expression of wide-eyed, terrified disbelief. David never mentioned any loans, I stammered, twisting the plastic pen in my hands. We did not need loans. Our house was paid for. Husbands keep many secrets from their wives, Mrs. Vanessa Thorne countered smoothly, especially when pride is involved. David did not just borrow a small sum. He leveraged his own business, and by extension, your shared marital assets to secure these loans. When his investments collapsed, he attempted to hide the debt by shuffling funds through various vendors associated with your father's company. He created a massive deficit in the logistics firm's quarterly ledgers. My father sighed heavily, playing the role of the betrayed patriarch. I tried to help the boy Vanessa. He came to me begging for a lifeline. I lent him the company's capital because he was family. And how did he repay me? By dying and leaving my company holding a $1.5 million bag of toxic debt. He ruined our quarterly projections. He nearly put my employees out of work. The sheer scale of their lies was breathtaking. They had constructed an entire alternate reality where my honest, hardworking husband was a desperate fraudster, and my ruthless father was a benevolent savior. They were counting on my grief to cloud my judgment. They believed that by dragging David's name through the mud, they would shatter my resolve and force me into a quick surrender. Thorne slid the stack of documents across the expansive glass and wood table. The heavy papers came to a stop right next to my cheap yellow notepad. These are the executed promissory notes and the corporate invoices, Thorne stated, his voice ringing with absolute manufactured authority. Every single one of these documents bears your late husband's physical signature. They explicitly tie him to the missing funds. Because you are his legal widow and the executor of his estate, this debt transfers directly to you. $1.5 million, Mrs. Vanessa. Payable immediately upon demand. I reached out with a trembling hand. I made sure my fingers visibly shook as I picked up the stack of papers. I brought them closer, my eyes darting across the printed text. I saw the fake corporate letterheads. I saw the inflated numbers. And at the bottom of each page, I saw the clumsily forged signature of the man I had loved. As I stared at the top sheet, my mind analyzed the data with cold forensic precision. The font formatting was inconsistent. The dates on the supposed transfers conflicted with standard banking holidays. It was incredibly sloppy work, likely thrown together by Bradley in a panic. But externally, I continued to play the broken widow. I let the papers rustle loudly in my shaking hands, ensuring that the three men across the table saw exactly what they wanted to see. They saw a woman completely overwhelmed by a legal nightmare she could not begin to understand. The rage burning inside me was hot enough to melt steel, but I kept my face frozen in a mask of total devastation. I let a single ragged breath escape my lips. I looked up at Thorne, my eyes wide and pleading. "I do not have $1.5 million, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the final syllable. Thorne leaned back in his chair, exchanging a swift, victorious glance with my father. Bradley grinned, practically vibrating with excitement. The trap had been laid, the bait had been taken, and they believed the prey was securely caught in their jaws. They had no idea I was memorizing the offshore routing numbers printed on their fake invoices, already planning exactly which federal databases I would use to tear their entire lives apart. I let my trembling fingers ghost over the stack of heavy bond paper. To my father, my brother, and their high-priced attack dog, I was a broken woman desperately trying to comprehend an insurmountable mountain of debt. In reality, I was a federal auditor running a high-speed diagnostic on a crime scene. As the director of threat finance, I spent my days hunting sophisticated state-sponsored cyber syndicates and international money laundering rings. What sat in front of me was not sophisticated. It was an absolute insult to white-collar crime. The first thing I noticed was the formatting. The kerning on the corporate letterhead was completely misaligned, a classic rookie mistake made when someone copies and pastes a logo onto a newly generated document instead of using official company software. Then came the dates. The supposed loan originations were time-stamped on weekends and federal holidays days when major commercial wire transfers simply do not process through domestic banking channels. But the most glaring catastrophic error was located in the footer of the second page. Bradley had generated fake routing and account numbers to represent the destination of the missing corporate funds. He likely thought stringing together a random sequence of digits would look sufficiently intimidating to a financially illiterate widow. But routing numbers are not random. The first two digits of the primary transit code listed on the document were 0 and 2. That specific prefix did not belong to any domestic banking institution. It belonged to an offshore financial clearinghouse based in the Cayman Islands. A clearinghouse currently under active investigation by my exact federal division for harboring illegal shell companies. My father and brother were not just forging David's signature to steal my house. They were inadvertently handing a federal director the exact paper trail needed to connect their regional logistics firm to international money laundering. I stared at the clumsy forgery of my late husband's signature. David had a very distinct, fluid way of crossing his letters, a byproduct of being left-handed. The signature on the paper was jagged, the ink pressure completely uniform, indicating it had been slowly, painstakingly traced by a right-handed person, likely Bradley. The sheer disrespect of it, the absolute violation of David's memory, fueled a cold, hyper-focused rage within me. I wanted to reach across the table and destroy them both, but I needed them to lock themselves inside their own cage first. I looked up from the papers, ensuring my eyes remained wide and brimming with unshed tears. I let my breathing become slightly erratic. Are you telling me that David transferred $1.5 million of your company's money into these specific accounts? I asked, my voice quivering perfectly. William Thorne leaned forward, resting his expensive gold pen on the glass table. That is exactly what we are telling you, Mrs. Vanessa. The paper trail is undeniable. The funds were diverted into those offshore holding accounts by your late husband to cover his disastrous personal investments. The liability falls squarely on his estate, which means it falls on you. I turned my gaze to my father. Harrison was sitting back in his plush leather chair, looking immensely satisfied. He truly believed he had orchestrated the perfect corporate execution. Dad, I whispered, injecting a desperate, pleading tone into my voice. Please, I am begging you. This cannot be right. David would never do this. Are you absolutely certain these financial records are accurate? Are you submitting these documents to this mediation under penalty of perjury? The trap was set. The jaws were open. I just needed him to step onto the pressure plate. My father did not hesitate. He scoffed, offended that his intellectually inferior daughter would even dare to question his authority. I am absolutely certain, Vanessa Harrison barked, his voice echoing in the large conference room. I personally audited these ledgers. Bradley and I oversaw the financial recovery efforts. These invoices and promissory notes are 100% accurate. They are official corporate records and we stand by them completely. We will submit them to any court under penalty of any law you choose to invoke. Your husband was a thief. Accept it. I felt a sharp, thrilling spike of adrenaline. He had just confessed to corporate fraud on a legally binding mediation record. I looked down at the documents again, pretending to be overwhelmed by the inescapable reality of my father's declaration. But I do not have the money to pay this, I cried, letting a single tear spill over my eyelashes and roll down my cheek. I do not have $1.5 million. You already took the $42,000 from my checking account. I have nothing left. How can you do this to me? Bradley leaned forward, a malicious grin spreading across his face. We are not doing anything to you, Vanessa. David did this to you, but we are offering you a way out. Sign the house over to the company, sign the life insurance over, do it right now today and we walk away. You get to keep whatever dignity you have left, and we do not drag David's name through a public criminal trial. I shrank back in my chair, wrapping my arms around my torso in a protective posture. But it is my home, I pleaded. It is where David and I lived. You cannot just take my home. I need time. I need to think. I cannot just sign away everything I own today. William Thorne's false patience finally evaporated. He dropped his hands flat onto the table, leaning in with aggressive, predatory intent. You do not have time, Mrs. Vanessa. And frankly, your emotional attachment to a piece of real estate is completely irrelevant. Let me make this very clear for you. If you refuse to sign this settlement agreement today, my firm will file this lawsuit in federal court tomorrow morning. We will freeze every asset tied to your name. We will put a lien on your property so you cannot sell it. Thorne paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering his final brutal threat. And if you attempt to fight us, if you attempt to drag this out and waste my client's time, we will not just sue you for the debt. I will personally petition the court to have you declared mentally incompetent to manage your husband's estate. I gasped, my hands flying to my mouth in mock horror. Oh yes, Thorne continued, smoothly savoring his own cruelty. We will bring in medical experts to testify about your severe depression, your sudden unemployment, your financial instability, and your complete inability to grasp basic reality following your husband's death. We will have a court-appointed conservator take control of your life. You will lose the house. You will lose the money, and you will lose your autonomy. Sign the papers, Vanessa. It is the only rational choice you have left. The sheer evil of their strategy was breathtaking. They were willing to strip away my basic human rights and lock me in a psychiatric hold just to steal my property. It was the ultimate betrayal executed with cold corporate efficiency. It was time for my grand finale. I began to hyperventilate. I took short, rapid breaths, letting my chest heave visibly beneath the oversized trench coat. I gripped the edges of the table, my knuckles turning white. I shook my head back and forth, my eyes darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. I cannot breathe. I gasped, clutching at my throat. I cannot do this right now. I cannot breathe. My mother, who had been sitting quietly in the corner observing the slaughter, rolled her eyes in profound annoyance. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Beatrice muttered. "Stop being so dramatic, Vanessa. You are embarrassing yourself again." I stood up abruptly. My chair tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the expensive Italian marble floor. The sudden noise startled Thorne, causing him to flinch away from the table. I grabbed my cheap yellow notepad and, with a swift, frantic motion, snatched the copies of the forged invoices and promissory notes from the glass table. I crushed the documents against my chest. "I need time," I cried out, my voice shrill and panicked. "Please, I just need time to think. I cannot sign anything today. My head is spinning. Please just give me a few days to process this. I will look at the papers. I promise I will look at them. Just let me breathe." I did not wait for their permission. I turned and practically ran toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I pushed my way out into the silent, art-lined corridor, leaving my father, my brother, and their high-powered lawyer sitting at the long walnut table. Behind me, I heard Bradley's arrogant, mocking laughter echoing through the open door. "Let her go!" "William," my brother scoffed. "She is completely broken. She just needs to go home and cry it out. She will be calling us by Friday begging to sign the deed just to make the scary lawyers go away. She has absolutely no other options." I rushed past the granite reception desk, keeping my head down and my shoulders slumped, ignoring the receptionist's judgmental stare. I hurried to the elevator bank and slammed my hand against the call button. The doors opened, and I stepped inside the empty stainless steel cab. As the doors slid shut, cutting me off from Thorne's luxurious, intimidating office, I finally dropped the act. I stopped hyperventilating. I straightened my posture, rolling my shoulders back until my spine was perfectly aligned. The panicked, weeping widow vanished instantly, replaced by the director of Threat Finance. I looked down at the crumpled stack of forged documents in my hands. I carefully smoothed out the heavy bond paper, ensuring the offshore routing numbers and my father's fraudulent claims were perfectly preserved. Bradley was right about one thing. I was going to go home. But I was not going to cry. I was going to log into the most secure federal database on the eastern seaboard. My family had just proudly confirmed on a legally binding mediation record their ownership of documents connecting their domestic logistics firm to an illegal Cayman Islands money laundering operation. They had handed me the exact rope I needed to hang them. Their fate was completely sealed. I drove out of the city and headed toward my secure facility, the adrenaline from the mediation still humming in my veins. The transition from the grieving, panicked widow in the beige trench coat to the director of Threat Finance was absolute. I scanned my credentials at the heavily fortified entrance, passed through 3 biometric checkpoints, and settled into my command center. It was a stark contrast to Thorne's opulent, mahogany-lined office. My workspace was a fortress of raw data, dominated by an array of high-resolution monitors connected directly to the most powerful financial tracking networks on the eastern seaboard. I laid the crumpled copies of the forged invoices and promissory notes on my desk. They were the keys to a kingdom built entirely on lies. I initiated a deep dive forensic analysis, targeting the offshore routing numbers printed on the fake documents. These numbers belong to the Cayman Islands Clearinghouse, currently under active investigation by my division. My father and brother had assumed this was an untraceable black hole, a safe haven where corporate funds could vanish without a trace. They fundamentally underestimated the reach of federal cyber intelligence. I bypassed commercial banking firewalls, tapping into international transactional ledgers that standard auditors could never access. I began mapping the flow of capital out of my father's regional logistics firm, following the digital breadcrumbs left by their sloppy, arrogant transfers. The initial results populated across my screens, painting a picture that was far more devastating than a simple attempt to steal my house. The financial hemorrhaging at my father's company had not started recently. The ledgers revealed a systemic, catastrophic collapse that had been ongoing for nearly 3 years. The firm was massively over-leveraged. They had taken out high-interest corporate loans to fund aggressive, poorly researched expansion projects spearheaded by Bradley. When those projects inevitably failed, they had doubled down, securing even more debt to cover the mounting losses. The company was drowning in liabilities, defaulting on vendor payments, and barely making payroll. My father and brother were not the titans of industry they pretended to be. They were desperate men standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. But the true depth of their depravity revealed itself as I tracked the specific funds tied to David's forged signature. They had not just created these fake invoices to steal my property. They had been using David's name posthumously to establish a complex, multi-layered money laundering operation. My husband had owned a legitimate independent consulting business with a pristine tax record. My father and brother had hijacked his company's corporate identity, creating mirror accounts in his name after his death. They had been systematically funneling millions of dollars out of their failing logistics firm and routing it through David's ghost accounts before moving it offshore to the Cayman Islands. The sheer scale of the fraud was staggering, and the motive was crystal clear. By creating these fake, massive debts on their corporate books, they were intentionally deflating their company's value to avoid paying federal corporate taxes. They were bleeding their own company dry, hoarding the stolen capital offshore to protect their personal wealth from the impending inevitable bankruptcy proceedings. And they were using a dead man as their ultimate scapegoat, ensuring that when the federal auditors eventually came knocking, the paper trail would lead directly to David's grave. I stared at the data mapping on my monitors, my jaw clenched tightly. They had weaponized my husband's death. They had seen his sudden passing not as a tragedy, but as a strategic opportunity to execute a flawless financial exit strategy. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They had sat at my dining table eating the food I had cooked, pretending to be concerned about my well-being while actively using my dead husband's identity to commit federal tax evasion and corporate fraud. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place as I analyzed their liquidity. The offshore accounts held millions, but that money was frozen, tied up in complex international holding structures that they could not easily access without triggering alarms. Domestically, they were completely broke. Their personal bank accounts were severely depleted, drained to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth, the country club memberships, the luxury sports cars, the designer suits. They had absolutely no liquid capital left in the United States. This explained their desperate, aggressive push to seize my home and David's life insurance. My $2 million property completely paid off, and the substantial life insurance payout represented the only accessible, untainted capital they could quickly liquidate. They needed my assets to satisfy their immediate aggressive creditors and to fund their legal defense when the bankruptcy finally hit. They had drained my $42,000 checking account, not just as an intimidation tactic, but because they actually needed the cash to maintain their daily operations. They were broke, desperate, and backed into a corner of their own making. They thought they were hunting me, but they were already dead in the water. I isolated the specific transactions linked to the forged promissory notes and compiled them into a comprehensive, highly classified federal dossier. I cross-referenced the offshore accounts with active Department of Justice watch lists, officially tagging my father's logistics firm as a primary target in an ongoing international money laundering investigation. I meticulously documented every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every instance of tax evasion. I built an airtight, irrefutable case of corporate fraud ready for immediate prosecution. I did not stop there. I needed to ensure that their primary weapon, the arrogant, ruthless William Thorne, was completely neutralized. I turned my attention to the man who had threatened to strip away my autonomy and lock me in a psychiatric facility. I opened a new secure window on my terminal and initiated a deep background check on William Thorne and his prestigious law firm. I was going to dismantle their entire operation piece by piece until there was absolutely nothing left for them to hide behind. I accessed the federal contracting database running a search for Thorne's firm. The results loaded instantly, confirming my suspicions. William Thorne was not just a corporate litigator. His firm was actively bidding on a massive, highly classified contract with the Department of Defense. This contract represented tens of millions of dollars in revenue and unparalleled prestige within the Washington legal community. To secure a contract of this magnitude, the bidding firm and its lead partners were required to undergo an exhaustive Level 5 security and financial clearance audit. I pulled up the clearance queue for my division. I scrolled through the pending applications, my eyes scanning the names until I found it. The security clearance application for William Thorne and his law firm was currently sitting in a pending status. It was awaiting final review and authorization by the Director of Threat Finance, the very woman he had just spent the morning mocking, threatening, and attempting to defraud. The irony was exquisite. William Thorne had built his entire career on crushing his opponents with overwhelming legal force. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he could threaten a grieving widow with institutionalization and face zero consequences. He had absolutely no idea that his entire multi-million-dollar future, the DoD contract, his firm's reputation, and his own personal security clearance rested entirely in the palm of my hand. He had arrogantly handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his career. I had the power to deny his clearance, flag his firm for financial irregularities, and permanently blacklist him from any future federal contracts. He was a dead man walking, and he did not even know it yet. I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that mirrored the one my brother had worn earlier. The trap was fully armed. It was time to close the jaws. The cursor blinked rhythmically on my encrypted monitor next to the name William Thorne. I leaned closer to the screen, letting the cool blue light of the federal database illuminate the dark office. Thorne had spent the entire morning treating me like an uneducated peasant. He had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my home. Now his entire professional existence was reduced to a single line of text awaiting my digital signature. I opened the master file for his firm. The contract they were bidding on was massive. The Department of Defense was seeking external legal counsel to manage international supply chain logistics and classified procurement disputes. The retainer alone was worth upwards of $50 million. To even be considered for a contract of this magnitude, a law firm had to undergo a Level 5 financial and security clearance. This was not a standard background check. A Level 5 clearance required absolute financial purity. The government needed to ensure that any attorney handling classified logistics data was completely immune to foreign blackmail, bribery, or corporate extortion. They scrutinized every bank account, every investment portfolio, and every client ledger. The auditing software searched for hidden debts, undisclosed offshore ties, and any associations with individuals engaged in active financial crimes. Thorne projected the image of a man who owned the world. He wore bespoke suits, imported silk ties, and heavy gold watches. He operated out of a high-rise office that cost tens of thousands of dollars a month just to lease. But my years as a forensic accountant had taught me that the loudest displays of wealth often masked the most desperate financial realities. I initiated a deep sweep of Thorne's personal and corporate financial history. The algorithms chewed through tax returns, bank statements, and property records. Within minutes, the facade began to crumble. Thorne was drowning in overhead costs. His firm had recently lost two major corporate clients to a rival agency, resulting in a catastrophic drop in billable hours. To maintain his lavish lifestyle and his prime real estate lease, Thorne had been heavily leveraging his personal assets. He had taken out massive lines of credit against his own home and borrowed against future anticipated earnings. The Department of Defense contract was not just a prestigious opportunity for him. It was a vital financial lifeline. He desperately needed that $50 million retainer to keep his firm from plunging into insolvency. He was a cornered animal wearing a silk tie. This desperation perfectly explained why a high-powered attorney like William Thorne had agreed to represent my father in a civil probate dispute. Normally, a man of his supposed caliber would not waste his time shaking down a grieving widow for a $2 million house. But my father and Bradley must have promised him an exorbitant contingency fee, or perhaps a significant share of the stolen life insurance payout. Thorne needed quick liquid capital to float his firm until the defense contract was awarded. He saw my late husband's estate as an easy target. He assumed he could bully me into signing over the deeds and policies within a matter of days, securing a rapid payout with minimal courtroom effort. But Thorne had made a catastrophic error in judgment. In his arrogance and his rush to secure a quick payday, he had failed to perform basic due diligence on his own clients. He had taken the forged promissory notes and the fake offshore invoices handed to him by my brother and presented them as legitimate legal documents during our mediation. As a licensed attorney, he had a strict fiduciary and ethical duty to verify the authenticity of the financial instruments he used to threaten opposing parties. By bringing those documents into a formal mediation setting and using them to attempt extortion, Thorne had firmly attached his own professional liability to my family's money laundering operation. I pulled up the exact compliance parameters for the Level 5 security clearance. Clause 4 specifically stated that any applicant found knowingly or unknowingly representing entities engaged in federal tax evasion, international money laundering, or wire fraud would face immediate disqualification from the bidding process. Furthermore, such associations mandated an automatic referral to the Federal Bar Association for disciplinary review. Thorne had tied his sinking ship directly to my father's burning empire. The offshore routing numbers printed on the fake invoices were already flagged in the federal system. The moment Thorne officially submitted those forged documents to a probate judge, he would be committing a felony while simultaneously under active review by the Department of Defense. It was professional suicide. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the profound weight of this realization settle over me. Thorne's entire multi-million-dollar future rested entirely in the hands of the broke widow he had been mercilessly harassing. He had threatened to strip away my autonomy and declare me mentally incompetent. He had weaponized my grief. Now I held the power to obliterate his entire legal career with a single keystroke. But I was not going to deny his clearance application yet. Denying it now would trigger an automated email notification to his firm, alerting him to the federal red flag before he had fully committed his crimes in open court. If I spooked him too early, he might withdraw from my father's case and attempt to scramble back into the shadows to protect his firm. I needed him to walk into that final probate hearing completely blind and bursting with unearned confidence. I needed him to stand in front of a sitting judge and proudly attempt to execute his extortion plan. Only then would the trap snap shut with inescapable finality. I moved my cursor over his pending clearance file. Instead of clicking Deny, I opened the Administrative Override menu. I placed a highly classified manual hold on his application, linking it directly to my personal investigative profile. I tagged the file with a code that indicated an active high-priority financial threat review. This ensured that no other federal auditor could process or approve his clearance without my direct physical authorization. I had effectively taken his entire professional future hostage. I spent the next 2 hours compiling the physical evidence I would need for the courtroom. Digital files were highly effective for back-end tracking, but high-stakes confrontations required tangible, devastating props. I opened a fresh federal dossier file. The thick red cardboard folder was emblazoned with the official seal of the Federal Threat Finance Agency. It was a document designed to command absolute terrifying authority in any legal setting. I printed the comprehensive financial analysis of Thorne's heavily leveraged law firm. I printed the specific clauses of the Level 5 security clearance requirements, highlighting the sections detailing immediate disqualification for associating with money laundering syndicates. I printed the cross-referenced data, linking the fake offshore routing numbers from my father's invoices directly to the Cayman Islands criminal investigation. Finally, I printed a hard copy of Thorne's pending clearance application, clearly showing the pending status awaiting the signature of the Director of Threat Finance. I arranged the documents meticulously inside the red folder. I took a heavy black permanent marker and began redacting specific sequences of sensitive operational data. The thick black lines slashing across the official government documents made the dossier look even more intimidating. It looked like a targeted assassination order for a corporate career. Which is exactly what it was. Men like Thorne operated on the assumption that women like me were acceptable collateral damage. They viewed the justice system as a playground designed exclusively for their enrichment. They destroyed families and looted estates without ever losing a minute of sleep. I closed the red folder and smoothed my hand over the embossed federal seal. I placed it carefully inside my secure briefcase, right next to the crumpled yellow notepad I had carried into his office that morning. The poetry of the situation was deeply satisfying. Bradley had ambushed me at a family dinner by dropping a manila folder filled with lies onto my table. William Thorne had ambushed me in a glass conference room by sliding a stack of forged papers across a walnut desk. In exactly 3 days, we were scheduled to meet in a civil courtroom for the final probate hearing. They were expecting to finalize their theft. They were expecting to watch the judge hand over my house and my husband's life insurance. Instead, I was going to walk into that courtroom and drop this red dossier directly onto William Thorne's lap. I was going to watch the color drain from his arrogant face as he realized that the helpless woman he had bullied was actually the federal executioner assigned to his firm's survival. I was going to make him understand the true cost of underestimating a woman simply because she did not brag about her paycheck. I locked the secure laptop, shutting down the connection to the federal grid. I returned the device to the biometric safe, sliding it back into its reinforced steel compartment. I swung the heavy oak bookcase back into place, the magnetic latch engaging with a quiet, solid click. The room transformed back into an unassuming suburban home office. I walked out of the room and headed toward my kitchen to pour a glass of water. The house was completely silent, but the oppressive weight of the past few days had vanished. My family had spent 4 months trying to bury me. They had coordinated a brutal multi-front assault on my finances, my home, and my sanity. They had utilized every toxic tactic they had perfected over my lifetime. They thought they had achieved checkmate. They had no idea they were simply pawns who had marched themselves directly into a federal kill box. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. I just had to wait for the sun to rise on the day of the hearing. The sun had barely broken over the horizon on Wednesday morning when I sat back down at my secure federal terminal. The dossier for William Thorne was already printed, bound, and locked in my briefcase, but neutralizing their attack dog was only the first half of my strategy. Now it was time to dismantle the castle my father had built. I brought the logistics firm up on my main monitor. Harrison constantly bragged about his company as if it were a sovereign nation, a testament to his unmatched brilliance. In the federal database, it was just a string of 9 digits, an employer identification number. I opened the Treasury Department portal designated for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The power granted to a director of threat finance is absolute when dealing with documented domestic and international fraud. I did not need to ask a judge for a warrant. I did not need to file a civil motion and wait 30 days for a response. With a few keystrokes, I initiated a hard, irrevocable freeze on the company's federal tax identification number. This was not a temporary hold or a simple compliance warning. This was the digital equivalent of dropping a concrete bunker over their entire corporate existence. By locking the tax ID, I instantly severed the logistics firm from the United States financial system. They could not process payroll. They could not pay vendors. They could not receive incoming wire transfers. And most importantly, they could not move a single cent of their remaining liquid capital to any offshore accounts. The system prompted me for the supporting evidence required to justify such a severe unilateral strike. I uploaded the high-resolution scans of the forged promissory notes and the fake Cayman Islands invoices. In the secondary attachment field, I uploaded the certified mediation log where my father proudly and arrogantly declared under penalty of perjury that these fabricated documents were completely accurate and legitimate corporate records. He had practically gift-wrapped his own federal indictment. By legally claiming those offshore routing numbers belonged to his company, he had bypassed years of tedious forensic investigation. He had handed the federal government a straight, undeniable line connecting his domestic logistics firm directly to an international money laundering syndicate. I hit submit. A green confirmation banner flashed across my screen. The trap was officially armed. Behind the scenes, hidden deep within the classified architecture of the federal government, an automated cascade of catastrophic consequences had just been unleashed. The system immediately flagged the corporate file and routed it to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Unit. Because the uploaded documents explicitly linked a domestic corporation to a known active offshore money laundering hub, the system automatically generated a Priority 1 intervention protocol. I watched the status code on my monitor shift from pending review to active field deployment. This meant that teams of federal agents, forensic accountants, and cybercrime specialists were currently being assembled. They were drafting the physical search warrants. They were mapping the layout of my father's corporate headquarters. They were preparing to execute a massive, unannounced raid. When the federal government moves on a Priority 1 financial threat, they do not send a polite email requesting an audit. They arrive in dark tactical vehicles wearing windbreakers carrying empty cardboard boxes to seize every hard drive, every physical ledger, and every single scrap of paper in the building. And the most beautiful part of this entire operation was the absolute deafening silence. The federal government does not warn a target when a raid is imminent. There would be no automated alerts sent to my father's phone. There would be no courtesy call from the bank. The freeze on their accounts was implemented on a shadow ledger, meaning the next time my brother tried to process a corporate transaction, the system would simply return a generic network error. They would assume it was a temporary glitch. They would blame their accounting software. They would have absolutely no idea that their financial heartbeat had just flatlined. I wanted them to remain completely blind. I wanted them to spend the next 48 hours reveling in their false sense of supremacy. I wanted them to walk into that courtroom on Friday morning believing they held all the cards completely unaware that the game had already ended. To ensure they remained comfortable in their delusion, I maintained my strict protocol of radio silence. As Wednesday bled into Thursday, my phone became a battlefield of one-sided warfare. The 48-hour deadline my father had issued was rapidly approaching, and my family was becoming increasingly frantic for a reaction. They needed to hear me beg. They needed the emotional validation of my surrender. My mother sent a series of lengthy, manipulative text messages. She started by playing the victim expressing her profound sorrow that I was forcing the family into such an ugly public dispute. When that failed to elicit a response, her tone quickly shifted to vicious insults. She told me I was a disgrace to David's memory, that I was selfishly holding on to a house I did not deserve, and that I would end up with absolutely nothing. Bradley opted for direct intimidation. He left 3 voicemails, his voice booming with arrogant confidence. He casually mentioned how much he was enjoying the thought of my upcoming eviction. He detailed the exact renovations he planned to make to my house once the judge handed him the deed. He reminded me that William Thorne had spent the last 2 days preparing a motion to have me declared mentally unfit, and mocked my inability to hire even a junior attorney to defend myself. I listened to every single voicemail. I read every single text message. I did not block their numbers, and I did not turn off my phone. I let their toxicity wash over me because it served as a stark, validating reminder of exactly why I was doing this. Every cruel word, every arrogant threat simply cemented my resolve. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded by their own hubris, taunting the very person who had just pushed them over the edge. Thursday evening arrived, bringing with it a strange, heavy tranquility. The eve of the final probate hearing. I sat in my living room drinking a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sun dip below the suburban tree line. My house was quiet, secure, and entirely mine. The two luxury sports cars were still locked in the commercial impound lot, racking up hundreds of dollars in daily storage fees that Bradley was currently too distracted to deal with. I thought about my father. I pictured him sitting in his lavish study, drinking expensive scotch, congratulating himself on a flawless corporate victory. I pictured him finalizing his strategy with William Thorne, completely oblivious to the fact that his prized attorney's career was already bleeding out on my federal desk. I imagined my father laying out his suit for the courtroom, eager to watch the judge crush his daughter into submission. What my father did not know was the exact timeline of the federal raid. I had seen the deployment schedule on my monitor. The coordinated strike on his corporate logistics headquarters was scheduled for exactly 10 in the morning on Friday. The final probate hearing was also scheduled for exactly 10 in the morning on Friday. The poetic symmetry of the timing was not an accident. While my father, my mother, and my brother were sitting inside a quiet, civilized civil courtroom, with their cell phones legally required to be powered off, federal agents would be kicking down the glass doors of their corporate empire. While William Thorne was standing up to address the judge and present his forged documents, federal auditors would be seizing the physical servers containing the evidence of their massive tax evasion. By the time my family walked out of that courthouse, their entire lives would be effectively over. I set my teacup down on the coffee table. I walked over to the front closet and pulled out the cheap, oversized beige trench coat. I draped it carefully over the back of a dining chair right next to the front door. I placed the flimsy yellow notepad and the chewed-up plastic pen in the pocket. Then I went into my bedroom and opened my closet. I reached past my casual weekend clothes and pulled out a pristine, razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. I ran my hand over the high-quality fabric, ensuring there was not a single wrinkle or imperfection. I retrieved my gold Federal Threat Finance Agency lapel pin from my jewelry box and fastened it securely to the collar of the suit jacket. I hung the tailored suit on the back of my bedroom door, ready for the morning. I was going to wear the suit. I was going to wear the trench coat over it. I was going to give them the exact pathetic broken widow they demanded to see right up until the judge banged the gavel. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to destroy me in open court. Tomorrow I was going to give them a show they would never forget. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a muffled thud. Friday morning had arrived, bringing with it the sharp, sterile scent of floor polish and absolute legal authority. The courtroom was relatively quiet. A few bored spectators and junior law clerks dotted the wooden gallery benches, waiting for their respective hearings to commence. The morning sun angled through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air above the polished tables. I walked down the center aisle, my posture deliberately hunched, my eyes fixed firmly on the carpeted floor. I was wearing the cheap, oversized beige trench coat buttoned all the way up to my chin. I had reapplied the subtle gray eyeshadow to ensure my face looked appropriately hollow and exhausted. I carried the same flimsy yellow notepad, now slightly crumpled at the corners. I looked exactly like a woman walking to her own execution. I took my seat alone at the defendant's table. The wooden chair groaned slightly under my weight. I kept my head down, clutching the yellow notepad to my chest, refusing to look across the aisle. But I did not need to look to know exactly what was happening at the plaintiff's table. I could feel their suffocating arrogance radiating across the room. My father Harrison sat perfectly straight, wearing his most expensive dark navy power suit. He looked completely unbothered, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch forced to make a difficult business decision. My mother Beatrice sat directly behind him in the first row of the gallery, dressed impeccably in a subtle gray designer dress. She clutched a small, expensive leather handbag on her lap, looking around the courtroom with mild distaste, as if she were enduring a slightly uncomfortable charity luncheon. And then there was Bradley. He sat next to our father, practically vibrating with poorly concealed glee. He was bouncing his knee up and down occasionally, leaning over to whisper something to William Thorne. Bradley thought he was about to witness the ultimate humiliation of the sister he despised. He thought he was walking out of this building today with the deed to a $2 million house. William Thorne sat at the head of their table. His expensive briefcase was open, his legal pads arranged with geometric precision. He looked bored. He looked like a man who considered this entire proceeding a complete waste of his highly valuable billable hours. He adjusted his heavy gold watch, totally unaware that the federal government was simultaneously tearing through his firm's security clearance file across the Potomac. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff, a stern-looking man with a booming voice, ordered the courtroom to rise. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Davis took the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s, known for her sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her reading glasses, opened the heavy probate file on her desk, and scanned the initial filings. The courtroom settled back down. The silence stretched for a long, uncomfortable moment as Judge Davis read through the aggressive demands William Thorne had drafted. Finally, she lowered the file and looked directly at me. Her expression softened slightly, a flicker of genuine pity crossing her features as she took in my oversized trench coat and my completely isolated position at the defendant's table. Mrs. Vanessa Judge Davis began, her voice carrying a professional but gentle tone. I have reviewed the filings submitted by the plaintiff. This is a highly complex corporate liability dispute involving significant assets. I must ask, where is your attorney? Are you waiting for counsel to arrive? I kept my eyes fixed on the tabletop. I let my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch further. I did not answer immediately, allowing the silence to hang in the air, creating the perfect vacuum for my family's arrogance to fill. I did not have to wait long. Bradley could not help himself. The opportunity to twist the knife in open court was simply too tempting for his fragile ego to resist. Bradley let out a sharp, derisive snort that echoed loudly across the quiet courtroom. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished table. "She cannot afford one, Your Honor," Bradley announced, his voice practically dripping with malicious joy. "She is completely bankrupt." The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. The sheer cruelty of the statement, delivered with a smug, self-satisfied grin, shocked the few spectators sitting in the gallery. My father did not attempt to quiet him. Instead, Harrison nodded proudly, endorsing his son's viciousness. Beatrice, sitting in the gallery, simply adjusted her posture completely, unbothered by the public display of familial abuse. Judge Davis frowned, her expression instantly hardening. She shot a sharp warning glare at the plaintiff's table. Mr. Thorne, the judge warned, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "You will control your clients in my courtroom. We do not mock opposing parties, especially unrepresented widows. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Thorne did not look embarrassed. He simply offered a smooth, insincere nod. "My apologies, Your Honor. Emotions are running high. This is a difficult family matter. However, my client's statement, while perhaps bluntly delivered, is factually accurate. The defendant has failed to secure legal representation. As such, we request that the court proceed with our motion for a summary judgment to settle the outstanding debt of $1.5 million. Thorne stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. He picked up a thick stack of documents from his table. "Your Honor, we have provided the court with fully executed notarized promissory notes and corporate invoices. These documents explicitly tie the defendant's late husband to the misappropriated corporate funds. Because the defendant refuses to negotiate or secure counsel, we ask the court to immediately authorize the transfer of the defendant's real estate assets and life insurance payouts to satisfy this debt." He was moving quickly, trying to railroad the judge before I could even formulate a coherent thought. He wanted the gavel to bang before the lunch recess. He wanted his contingency fee secured. Judge Davis looked back at me. The pity in her eyes had deepened into profound concern. "Mrs. Vanessa," the judge said softly, "I strongly advise you to request a continuance to secure legal aid. If you do not challenge these filings today, I will have no choice but to rule based on the documentation presented by the plaintiff. You stand to lose your home. Do you understand what is happening here?" I finally looked up. I looked directly at Judge Davis. I did not look scared. I did not look broken. I let the facade drop completely from my face, allowing my natural cold professionalism to settle over my features. "I understand exactly what is happening here, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. I stood up from my chair. The movement was sharp and deliberate. I did not tremble. I did not hesitate. I reached up to the top button of the oversized beige trench coat. "I do not need an attorney for this matter, Your Honor," I continued, my voice easily carrying across the large room. "Because this is no longer a civil probate dispute." I unbuttoned the coat and let it slide off my shoulders. The heavy fabric pooled onto the wooden chair behind me. I stood before the court wearing my razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. The bright overhead lights caught the edge of the gold Federal Threat Finance Agency lapel pin secured to my collar. I turned my head and looked directly at my family for the first time since I walked into the room. Bradley's smug grin vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, stupid confusion. My father's brow furrowed, his eyes darting to my lapel pin. Beatrice actually gripped the wooden bench in front of her, sensing that something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. But I was not focused on my family. They were already dead men walking. I turned my attention entirely to the arrogant, ruthless attorney who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. "This is a federal fraud investigation," I announced. I reached down and picked up the heavy, bright red federal dossier I had concealed beneath the yellow notepad. I did not wait for the judge's permission to approach. I walked confidently across the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I walked directly to the plaintiff's table. I stopped right in front of William Thorne. Thorne was frozen. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were locked onto the heavy red folder in my hands, instantly recognizing the official seal of a federal intelligence agency. The absolute unshakable confidence he had radiated just moments ago was completely shattered. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. I dropped the heavy red dossier directly onto his meticulously organized legal pads. The resulting thud echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register meant only for him and the judge to hear. "Before you submit those forged financial documents into the court record and commit a felony, let me ask you a very specific question." I leaned closer, resting my hands flat on his table, invading his space entirely. "Who signed your firm's pending Department of Defense security clearance last Thursday?" I kept my hands planted firmly on the polished wood of the plaintiff's table. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch further, ensuring that William Thorne was entirely trapped in my line of sight. He could not look away. He could not run. He was pinned beneath the absolute crushing weight of federal authority. "Who signed it, Mr. Thorne?" I repeated, my voice steady, sharp, and totally uncompromising. "I want you to look at the redacted clearance application sitting in that red dossier. I want you to look at the signature line at the bottom of the final page, and I want you to read the name out loud to this court." Thorne did not move. He was completely paralyzed. His expensive gold pen had slipped from his fingers, rolling silently across his legal pad. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. The arrogant, predatory lawyer who had threatened to strip me of my human rights just 3 days ago was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified, broken man who had just realized his entire multi-million-dollar future was currently burning to ash in front of him. He slowly, shakily reached out and opened the heavy red folder. He bypassed the financial analysis of his leveraged firm. He bypassed the Cayman Islands routing data. He flipped straight to the final page of the dossier. He stared at the Department of Defense security clearance application. He stared at the signature line. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. "You," Thorne whispered the word, barely escaping his lips. "You are the director." I straightened my posture, stepping back from the table. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, I am the director of Threat Finance. I am the federal auditor currently managing your firm's Level 5 security clearance application, the application you desperately need to secure that $50 million Department of Defense contract to save your firm from insolvency." The courtroom remained dead silent. My father Harrison looked confused, his brow furrowed as he tried to comprehend the sudden shift in power. Bradley looked panicked, sensing the danger, but not fully understanding the mechanics of it. Beatrice had frozen in the gallery, her hands gripping her expensive purse until her knuckles turned white. "And now, Mr. Thorne," I continued, my voice carrying clearly to the judge's bench. Let us discuss the documents you brought to court today. The documents you intend to submit to Judge Davis to secure a summary judgment against my late husband's estate. I am assuming you performed the requisite due diligence required by the Federal Bar Association to verify the authenticity of those financial records. Because if you submit fabricated evidence to this court, you are committing a felony. And if you knowingly associate your firm with a domestic corporation actively engaged in offshore money laundering, your security clearance will be permanently revoked. Thorne swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his silk tie. He looked down at the stack of forged promissory notes and fake invoices sitting on his desk. The documents my father and brother had provided. The documents they had assured him were completely legitimate. He looked at the offshore routing numbers printed on the pages, the numbers I had highlighted in the red dossier, explicitly linking them to the Cayman Islands criminal investigation. Thorne realized the trap. He realized he had been used as a pawn by two arrogant, desperate men who had handed him a live grenade. He had tied his sinking firm directly to an active federal money laundering syndicate. Your Honor. Thorne said, his voice cracking slightly as he stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floor. I must apologize to the court. I have just been made aware of a severe, irreconcilable conflict of interest regarding my representation of the plaintiffs in this matter. My father's head snapped toward his attorney. What are you doing? William Harrison demanded, his voice thick with shock. Sit down. You are supposed to be finalizing the settlement. Thorne ignored him completely. He did not even look at my father. He looked only at Judge Davis. Furthermore, Your Honor. Thorne continued speaking rapidly, his hands shaking as he gathered his legal pads. I must formally withdraw all motions and filings submitted to this court on behalf of the logistics firm. I cannot in good faith authenticate the financial documents provided by my clients. I am officially withdrawing my representation effective immediately. William, are you out of your mind? Bradley yelled, standing up and grabbing Thorne's arm. You cannot just leave us here. We paid you a retainer. You promised us the deed to the house. Thorne violently wrenched his arm out of Bradley's grasp. He shot my brother a look of pure, concentrated venom. You lied to me, Thorne hissed, his voice dropping low, but still audible in the quiet courtroom. You handed me forged documents tied to an international federal investigation. You almost destroyed my entire firm. If you ever contact me again, I will personally assist the federal prosecutors in drafting your indictment. Thorne practically threw the forged documents back onto the table. He shoved his legal pads into his expensive briefcase, snapped the lock shut, and turned toward the center aisle. He did not look at me as he passed. He walked quickly, his head down, pushing through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. The doors swung shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing his exit. The silence rushed back into the room, heavier and more oppressive than before. My father and brother were left standing alone at the plaintiff's table, completely exposed, stripped of their legal protection. They looked like two captains standing on the deck of a ship that had just been blown out of the water. Judge Davis watched Thorne's hasty retreat, her expression hardening into absolute steel. She turned her sharp gaze back to the plaintiff's table. Mr. Harrison, Judge Davis said, her voice dripping with judicial authority. Your attorney has just withdrawn from this case and explicitly refused to authenticate the financial documents you are attempting to use to seize the defendant's assets. Do you have an explanation for the court? My father, typically so composed and arrogant, stammered. He adjusted his tie, his face flushed a deep, embarrassed red. Your Honor, I do not understand what is happening. There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding. My attorney is overreacting. These documents are legitimate. David owed us money. I turned my attention back to the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiff is lying to this court. He is attempting to use the civil probate system to cover up a massive ongoing corporate fraud scheme. I picked up the red dossier from the plaintiff's table. I walked over to the bench and handed the folder directly to the bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Davis. Inside that dossier, Your Honor is certified unredacted proof that the plaintiff's logistics firm is heavily leveraged and facing imminent bankruptcy. I explained, my voice ringing clear and strong. More importantly, it contains forensic evidence that the plaintiff and his son forged my late husband's signature on those documents. They created ghost accounts using David's name posthumously to funnel millions of dollars out of their failing company. They diverted those funds to illegal offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands to avoid federal corporate taxes. Judge Davis opened the red dossier. The courtroom was perfectly still as she scanned the highlighted routing numbers, the forensic analysis of the forged signatures, and the direct links to the federal money laundering database. They thought they could steal my home and my husband's life insurance to secure liquid capital before their creditors forced them into liquidation. I continued turning to look directly at my father. They thought they could execute this theft quietly because they believed I was a financially illiterate, helpless widow who could not afford to defend herself. They did not know that I am the director of threat finance for the federal government. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The daughter he had spent 34 years dismissing, mocking, and underestimating was the federal architect of his absolute destruction. Bradley fell back into his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He looked physically ill. The arrogant, smug heir apparent was gone. In his place sat a man who suddenly realized he was going to federal prison. I locked my father's logistics firm's federal tax identification number 48 hours ago. I stated delivering the final fatal blow. I froze their accounts and initiated a Priority 1 federal audit. They are currently completely insolvent. They cannot pay you, Your Honor. They cannot pay their vendors. And they certainly cannot afford to pay another attorney. Judge Davis looked up from the dossier. Her expression was a mask of cold, judicial fury. She looked at my father, then at Bradley. Mr. Harrison, Judge Davis, commanded, her voice slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. This court will not be used to facilitate corporate embezzlement or fraud. I am dismissing your motion for summary judgment with extreme prejudice. I am permanently enjoining you and your firm from making any further claims against the estate of the deceased. She picked up her gavel. And based on the compelling federal evidence provided by the defendant, I am suspending these civil proceedings indefinitely pending a full criminal investigation. The gavel banged down. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the courtroom, signifying the absolute, undeniable end of my family's corporate reign. They had walked into this building expecting to execute a flawless theft. They were walking out with nothing but impending federal indictments. The checkmate was complete, and the board belonged entirely to me. The echo of the judge's gavel hung in the air like a physical weight. My father stood frozen at the plaintiff's table, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend the totality of his defeat. He was a man who had spent his entire life dictating the terms of reality to everyone around him. Now reality was dictating its terms to him. "Your Honor, please," Harrison stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. "This is a gross misunderstanding. My daughter is clearly confused. We can explain the offshore accounts. They are perfectly legal tax deferment vehicles. If you just give my legal team time to review the documents, we can clarify everything." Bradley chimed in, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "She hacked us, Your Honor. She just admitted to freezing our corporate accounts without a warrant. You cannot let her do this." Judge Davis did not even blink. She fixed her cold, unwavering gaze on my brother. "Mr. Harrison, the defendant, is a high-ranking federal director who just submitted classified forensic evidence of international money laundering directly into my courtroom. She does not need a warrant from me to freeze your assets. She has federal authority. And frankly, considering the fabricated evidence you attempted to submit to this court today, you are incredibly lucky. I am only suspending this hearing and not holding you both in summary contempt." She gestured sharply to the armed bailiff standing by the heavy wooden doors. "Escort the plaintiffs out of my courtroom. We are adjourned." The bailiff stepped forward, placing a firm hand on my father's shoulder. Harrison violently shrugged him off his face, flushing a deep, dangerous red. He glared at me across the aisle, his eyes practically burning with raw, unfiltered hatred. But he had no power here. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes slamming against the floor. Bradley followed close behind him, looking pale, terrified, and entirely broken. I calmly gathered my red dossier, slipping it back into my briefcase. I picked up the cheap beige trench coat from the chair, folded it neatly over my arm, and walked down the aisle. Beatrice had already rushed out of the gallery, hurrying after her husband and son. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the expansive marble-lined corridor. The hallway was not empty. Standing directly outside the courtroom doors were 6 men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The bright yellow letters FBI and IRSCI were boldly printed across their backs. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of federal authority. The coordinated strike on my father's corporate headquarters had clearly yielded immediate, devastating results. The agents had secured the building, seized the servers, and found exactly what my audit told them they would find. Now they were here to collect the architects of the fraud. My father stopped dead in his tracks. Bradley slammed into his back, letting out a sharp gasp as he saw the federal agents blocking their path to the elevators. "Harrison Vance and Bradley Vance," the lead agent stated, stepping forward. He held up a federal warrant, his voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." "This is absurd," Harrison roared, his polished demeanor completely shattering. "I am a respected CEO. You cannot do this. I demand to speak to my attorney." "Your attorney fled the building 15 minutes ago, Mr. Vance," the agent replied smoothly. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Bradley began to hyperventilate. The golden child, the arrogant heir who had parked his luxury sports cars on my driveway just yesterday, was now openly weeping in a public courthouse. "Dad, do something!" Bradley sobbed as an agent grabbed his wrists and pulled them behind his back. "Dad, tell them it was a mistake. Tell them we did not know." The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the marble corridor was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of accountability. It was the sound of a 34-year nightmare finally coming to an end. Suddenly, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered the professional calm of the arrest. Beatrice lunged forward from the gallery seating area in the hallway, her face contorted in absolute agony. She tried to grab my father's arm, but 2 federal agents smoothly intercepted her, pushing her back to a safe distance. "Do not touch my husband." Beatrice shrieked, her designer handbag falling to the floor, its expensive contents spilling across the tile. "Do not touch my son Harrison. What is happening?" She spun around wildly until her eyes locked onto me. I was standing quietly a few feet away, watching the execution of justice with perfect, unbothered stillness. Beatrice charged toward me, her hands curled into claws, her eyes wide with manic fury. A female federal agent immediately stepped between us, holding up a warning hand, but Beatrice ignored her, screaming directly into my face over the agent's shoulder. "You did this!" My mother screamed, tears of rage ruining her immaculate makeup. "You ungrateful, vicious little monster! We gave you life, we gave you a family, and you destroyed us. You destroyed your own flesh and blood over money. You are a monster, Vanessa." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, inadequate, and invisible. I looked at the woman who had willingly helped my father and brother attempt to steal my home and my dead husband's life insurance just to fund their lavish criminal lifestyle. I met her hysterical, hateful gaze with absolute chilling calm. "I didn't destroy anything, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through her screams like a blade. "I just stopped paying for your mistakes." I turned my back on her. I did not look back as the agents marched my father and brother toward the freight elevators. I did not look back as my mother collapsed onto the marble floor, sobbing over the ruins of her fake, pathetic social empire. I walked toward the main exit, stepped out into the bright, crisp morning air of the city, and took my first breath as a truly free woman. The fallout over the next 6 months was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The federal raid on my father's logistics company yielded a mountain of undeniable evidence. The offshore accounts were seized and repatriated by the Treasury Department. The company was completely liquidated to pay the massive federal tax fines and the secured creditors. Every truck, every warehouse, and every piece of office furniture was auctioned off. Harrison and Bradley were denied bail deemed extreme flight risks due to their offshore connections. They eventually accepted plea deals to avoid decades in a federal penitentiary, but they still received substantial prison sentences. The luxury sports cars Bradley had parked on my driveway were seized directly from the predatory impound lot by federal marshals and sold at a government auction. Beatrice faced the most poetic justice of all. With the family's assets entirely frozen and seized, her wealthy, powerful friends abandoned her instantly. The country club revoked her membership. The socialites she had spent decades trying to impress stopped returning her calls, terrified of being associated with a federal criminal investigation. Completely broke and entirely alone, she was forced to vacate her massive suburban mansion. She moved into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She had to take a job working the cash register at a local discount retail store just to afford her groceries. She was finally living the exact miserable life she had so gleefully wished upon me. I never spoke to them again. I blocked their numbers, ignored the desperate letters they sent from prison, and completely erased them from my reality. They were ghosts, fading memories of a life that no longer belonged to me. A year later, the autumn air was crisp and cool. I sat on the sprawling back porch of my beautiful $2 million home in Alexandria. The leaves on the old oak trees were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, catching the soft morning sunlight. The house was entirely mine, fully paid off, and completely safe from anyone who might try to take it. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. The sliding glass door opened behind me, and the sound of warm, genuine laughter spilled out onto the porch. My business partner, David's old best friend, walked out carrying a tray of fresh pastries. Behind him, two of my top forensic accountants from the agency followed, arguing playfully about a recent case file. They pulled up chairs around the patio table, pouring their own coffee, and settling into the comfortable, easy rhythm of true friendship. These were the people who knew my heart. These were the people who respected my mind, who celebrated my victories, and who supported me without asking for anything in return. This was my chosen family. I looked out over the sprawling garden where David used to read his books. The grief of losing him would always be a part of me, a quiet echo of the love we had shared. But the heavy, suffocating pain was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. He had built this home with me, and I had defended it. I had defended his honor, my career, and my autonomy. My colleagues continued their cheerful banter, their voices blending with the rustling autumn leaves. I leaned back in my chair, wrapping both hands around my warm coffee mug. The shadows of my toxic, abusive family had been permanently banished from my property and my mind. I took another deep, satisfying breath, smiled at the people who truly mattered, and embraced the beautiful, brilliant life I had secured for myself. The greatest lesson I learned from watching my family build their own trap is that your worth is never defined by the people who consistently underestimate you. For 34 years, my parents and brother treated me like a naive, helpless scapegoat. They believed that because I did not brag about my achievements or match their loud, toxic arrogance, I was weak. But true power does not need to scream for attention. True power is quiet. It is the steady, silent work of building your own independence, your own career, and your own financial security, far away from the hands of those who only want to use you. When toxic people try to back you into a corner, they expect an emotional explosion. They feed on your panic, your tears, and your desperation. The most devastating thing you can do to a narcissist is deny them that reaction. I did not have to actively destroy my family. I simply stepped aside, removed my financial support, and let their own greed, arrogance, and illegal choices pull them under. Sometimes the ultimate revenge is not an attack at all. It is simply allowing cruel people to experience the natural consequences of their own actions. You do not owe your loyalty to people who view your grief as a business opportunity. Family is not determined by blood or shared last names. Family is defined by the people who stand by you when you are vulnerable, who celebrate your success without jealousy, and who protect your peace rather than destroying it. I lost my biological relatives, but I gained the freedom to live an authentic, beautiful life with the people who truly matter. If you have ever been underestimated by toxic relatives or had to cut ties to protect your own peace, let me know your story in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power. Remember, your silence can be your strongest shield, and your success is the only statement you ever need to make.